Cool. Let's see. So, hi everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of our backend lecture series. And today we're going to cover something that's very exciting and it's like super essential for backend development, which is REST API, HTTP methods. And we are also going to cover briefly how to use Postman. It's a very, very powerful API request tools that you can use. It kind of functions like curl, but instead it's GUI. So, and we also going to cover Flask. So there are a lot of things that needs to be covered in this lecture. Now let's get started. So first of all, what's REST API? You can see like there are like tons of text here, but essentially REST API is just a kind of like a standard for how we structure our API calls on the internet. What's like some of the most basic feature, what the most essential feature for REST API includes like, first of all, it needs to be a client server relationship. It means that the client can send the API requests to the server. The server can then respond with the API response to the client. That's kind of like a REST API, one of the REST API feature. Also, the API calls should all be stateless. What does it mean by stateless? It means that all the each request from client to server or each response from server to client must include all the information necessary to understand this request. So essentially, like you can't assume server knows anything. You must like include all the information within the request, so that server can essentially like process any request that they receive. It also needs to be cacheable, but this is like more advanced. Also, REST API provides a uniform interfaces. So there are like GETs, there are like a bunch of other stuffs. Also, layered system, it's like more advanced. We won't cover that. Also, code on demand. It's like essentially, it's very easy to. It's very scalable using REST API. Let's see. And also, let's talk about HTTP methods. So essentially, like REST API is just kind of like a concept. It's a standard. And when it comes to coding, the real like API backends, the HTTP methods matters a lot more. And here are like the majority of the HTTP methods. And to be honest, like the most common ones that we are going to use is the first 5 HTTP methods. So the first one is get. And get is essentially to when the client requests a HTTP GET request to the server, it's usually like requesting for some specific resources. So essentially, if you want to fetch a blog article from the server, you can use the get method. And the head method essentially is asking for a response identical to that of a get request, but without the response body. So yeah, actually head request, we probably don't use that much. But essentially it's just asking for a response identical to that of a get request, but without the body. So sometimes the body plays some role in the get request. For example, you can put for example, you're requesting for an article from the server, and then you can post the article ID, the ID of the article either through the get request URL or through the get request body. However, like with head, you just like you can use the body. Also, like when you use the head, you won't get the response body back. So that's what the head. We usually just use get instead of head. So, and there's also post. And post is essentially like when user creates something new and they submit it through a form. For example, a sign-in form or a login form. Then we can use post. And the post will submit the form that the user just filled out to the server. And then it will trigger some side effects or changing state. For example, the user can successfully like log in or like being not successfully logging. So yeah, so that's post request. There's also put requests. And what's post put request? So essentially it's like when the user trying to upload a file, you will use a put request. So for example, if you are trying to upload a song onto SoundCloud, when you're trying to like publish a record, and then you need to use the put request. And the put request will contain essentially the file, and then the server will receive the file and then parse it and store it in the database. And that's the put method. There's also the delete method. And delete method is like, it's very straightforward. So essentially it's like used to delete some specific files or specific resources. Say if you want to delete a file, delete an article post, delete like say your username or your user account, you all use delete. And there are also like lots of other HTTP methods. You can essentially like try to discover them after this course. And we definitely encourage you to like discover more about HTTP methods, but these are like some methods that's like not used that frequently. So yeah. And now if you look at this picture is essentially like a breakdown of the HTTP request. As you can see, it starts with a request line, and the request line has the, first of all, the method. Here is a get method, and here is the kind of like the place that the request just sent. So the request you can see is sent from this place. And also here's the HTTP version. And to the host essentially like the target that the request is going to send to. And here are like some metadata. And here's also like a request message body. So it's essentially requesting a book of ID 12345, and author should be this guy. And yeah, so essentially like this is a very common like HTTP request like message. And to be honest, you don't this may seems a little bit complicated, but when you're coding, you don't need to actually like code all of it. You just need to specify like some of it. For example, the body and the method. That'll pretty much be the be the majority of the things that you need to do. The content length, the user agent, accept encoding, blah blah blah. This will all handled by the package that we are going to use. Yeah. And here are some like details into like the HTTP methods that we just talked about. And yeah, also we have the request header. Here's the header, request body, here's the body. So yeah. And so after we talked about requests, let's talk about HTTP response. Actually, before we move to response, do we have any question? Is there something I have to do for attendance? No. So essentially, like we will keep track of the attendance. Yeah. So no worries. Actually, let me just take a screenshot of all the attendees. Cool. Are there any questions? Okay, yeah, let's move on. So the first part will be like a little bit conceptual. So now let's talk about HTTP response. So we just finished HTTP requests. And request is essentially like client sending requests to the server. And response is how like the server will create a response to a client. And people should be like a little bit more familiar with the response, because like sometimes you will receive like a 404 not found. And that's a very common kind of like HTTP response that people will be experiencing like on a daily basis. And so 404 is a not found response. That's like most people like the most common response that people know. And when a server responds with like, okay, since it's successful, the code will be start with 2, and you can see all the relevant information from this chart. And so some of the more commonly used ones, for example, 200. 200 means that, okay, the GET request or whatever request that you just sent to us has been responded as successful. And so that's 200. It's like the most common ones. Also 201. 201 means created. So essentially, if you submit a post response or a put response, then the resource will be like created or updated successfully. Then the server will send a 201 response back. There's also the 401 unauthorized response. So say if you want to like log on to Cal Central without like logging in or something like that, you will get the unauthorized response, unauthorized error code. And there's also 403, it's forbidden. So when you're trying to access something that's like out of your reach, for example, you want to access some private files on a server, it will like say 403 forbidden if they like keep their security well. And there's also the 404 not found, which is like the page is not found. For example, if you visit some page that's not routed or that's like not being created properly, you will receive a 404 not found response. There's also a very funny one. It's kind of like a meme response. It's 418 response. It's called I'm a teapot. And the meaning of that is the server refuses attempt to brew coffee with a teapot. That's kind of like Easter egg within all the status code, I guess. So yeah, so that's for the most commonly seen HTTP response. I would say like sometimes people just use 404 as a catch-all or like 500. Well, actually 500 is also a pretty common one. It's kind of like just a catch-all server error. And like, so for example, when the logic breaks, so say if there's like some bug in the code, you can catch it and then send a 500 server error, 500 like error code. It means that like, okay, we are experiencing some difficulties. Yeah. Here are the kind of like the generic code and description. So 1 means it's informational, 2 means success, 3 means redirection. That's not a very commonly seen one. And 4 means there's some error, and 5 means there's some server error. So yeah. And you can find like more about the status code here in this website. And all the information is like pulled from this website. So yeah. Any questions for HTTP response? Cool. So let's move on. So now let's briefly introduce JSON. So JSON is short for JavaScript Object Notation. It's essentially like it's just a format, and it's essentially a way for the applications to transmit data on the internet. And so essentially, like if there's a server communicating to the client, the response of the body, and also oftentimes the request of the body is going to, the body of the request is going to be in JSON format. So you can see like JSON format is very similar to an object in JavaScript. And you can see like, however, one difference is that for a JavaScript object, the property of an object doesn't need to be wrapped in string. However, in JSON, everything should be wrapped in string. So essentially, even if it's an integer, you need to wrap it in string. So yeah, essentially like besides this, everything is the same from the object. So yeah, and you can see everything's wrapped around code. And JSON is very useful in writing the HTTP request body. And we are going to try out this in a bit. Yeah. So now let's look at RESTful server in action. We can take a look at Postman real quick. And so here we have built a, here's kind of like some skeleton code, or I would say like finished code for a to-do app, a very, very naive to-do app. So let's copy and paste it. Copy to clipboard. Okay. Now let's make a directory called REST API. We go into this directory, clear the console code, and let's copy the file. Let's just call it server.js. Okay. After we have the server.js file, and remember from the last class, we also need to like init it as a npm package. So let's do that. So it's npm init, and we have our package. As you can see, like usually on default, the entry point for an npm package will usually be default to index.js. However, if you have created a JavaScript package beforehand, a JavaScript file beforehand, then it will like automatically detect that JavaScript file and it will make it become the entry point. So that's very handy. So after we get this, let's install some packages.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah. What do you mean by the entry point?
Oh, entry point. So it's kind of like so okay, so for an Express server that may not be that obvious, but for a package, it's kind of like the first file that it will run. So yeah, it's kind of like the main file for Python.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but right now, because like we are treating our npm package not really as a package, because like we're just using all the npm install function, so like the webpack function of like packaging it as a package. So the entry point actually does not matter that much. So yeah, good question.
Do
Any
we
other
have
question?
to, do we have to install packages every time we do npm init?
Yeah, we have to like install the packages.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, so essentially like if you create a JavaScript file, it won't automatically download all the required packages. So yeah, but if it's a package that has something in the package.json file, so as you can see, like I just installed Express, so you can find this Express here. However, if you have like a ready package.json file, and you can just use like npm install. After you hit enter, it will like install everything in the dependencies file, this dependencies property. So yeah. Cool. Okay, so what I've just done is I have pasted the code from the Notion into the VS Code, and then I essentially like install npm. I install Express. I think that's the only thing that we actually need to install. Yeah. So we should be good. It's clear, and let's try Node server.js. Yeah, and you can see here server is listening on port like 8080. So that's pretty neat. And here we have included a URL like down in the code file. It's localhost 8080 /API. So let's go to that. Let's open a browser. Cool. As you can see, like if you paste the URL into the browser, you will receive a message. It's saying like "Welcome to the To-Do app." And so this is essentially a very basic to-do application that we put up. And I will go through this like right now. And actually, before I go through this, is there any questions for the setup? Because like I recommend you all like set it up now. Because like after we go through all the code, we'll be talking about how to use Postman. And Postman, you can like after you set out the server, you can try it out by sending HTTP requests to the server that we just set up. So yeah, cool. Now let's get started talking about the code. We'll went through this like pretty quickly, because like we have already like covered some basic from the previous lecture, I believe. So let's see. Okay, so we import the Express package, and here we essentially like make an app from the Express. We have our port. This is essentially like saying that if there is some like if it's deployed on a cloud like provider, on a server provider, it will just use the available port there. And if it's not, it will use the default port. The default port we set is like 8080. So yeah, there's also a router package. So router package is essentially a way for you to it's really like it's just a way for you to concatenate all the .get and .post response together. So yeah, it's kind of like a syntax sugar. So if you look at the okay, so if you look at the code from the previous Node intro course, let's see. So if we look at the hello world, we can see that the app.get, it first get the if it's followed by the URL, and then the function that's like being in charge of like handle this request. After we use the router package, like the router here, the router plugin that the Express provides, we can specify the route here on router.route to-dos, and then we can add like HTTP methods after this route. So essentially, like if you look at the two files, it's just like changing the order. Instead of like specifying the HTTP method that we're going to use, we specify the URL that we're going to use first, and then we can like build more HTTP methods, like one or multiple HTTP methods for that one URL. So yeah, that's what we are trying to do. And right now, if we look at the first HTTP API, the API that we wrote here, it's essentially like saying that if the user visits the root URL, we will greet them with some message saying welcome to the to-do app. And here, actually, if you look at the browser, the root URL, we are not actually visiting a root URL. We are visiting the API URL. And why is that happening? Because like we are using the app.use /API router, and by using this line of code, you will essentially say it's essentially saying that you will treat /API as the root URL instead of like the usual root URL like that. So yeah, that's essentially like what this line is trying to do. Trying to change the root URL from this to this. Yeah. And as you can see, like after we visit API, we get this response saying that message and welcome to the to-do app. And that's like a very straightforward and easy message. And now let's look at the second API endpoints. So the second API endpoints that we are providing here is the to-dos. Now, actually, let's try to visit. So to-dos. As you can see, we actually get a message saying that cannot get to-dos. And this has something to do with like, oh, actually, yeah, this has something to do with, first of all, we should actually directly add it after the APIs. So like this. So yeah, and after we run it, we can see like it's saying the message called return all to-dos. However, there's like no to-do return because like it's just a dummy HTTP, it's just a dummy to-do app. We haven't like include any methods. We haven't connected the database to store all the to-dos. So right now it's just returning like a dummy message saying return all to-dos. However, like this is essentially like good enough for us now because like we're just trying to use Postman and this dummy HTTP method, dummy HTTP server to see like how we can use Postman. So right now we have this to-dos URL, and let's open up our Postman app. So let's go to Postman. And let's open it. And so Postman is essentially an app that allows you to send HTTP requests. So instead of like sending it here in the browser, you can send it here inside the Postman app. So let's copy and paste. So first of all, you can open a new collection. And you can just say your name, collection name, and blah, blah, blah. And after you open the like a collection, you can then like click the collection. And here you will see like view more actions. You can like add requests. And then you can just like randomly add some name, for example, to-dos request. So after you add a to-do request, you can see here, the method is get. And if we look at the API, that's exactly what we wanted. So now we just essentially choose get. And then it says enter the request URL. So let's enter the request URL. And after we click send, we can see that in the body here, now, so essentially like the part below here is the body that we are receiving. And the body is saying that it's message, return all to-dos. Yeah, it's essentially the same thing that we get here. People may ask, like, why, since we can already see this inside the browser, why don't we just use a browser to view all the response from a HTTP server instead of like using Postman? And the reason for that is it's very hard for the browser to generate a request other than the get request. So we can see here at our to-dos endpoint, we have two methods. The first method is a get method. It allows the server to process a get request. And in the second one here, it allows the server to process a post request. So how does the server process a post request? It just uses the .post method. So as you can see here, after the .post method, it's saying like it will return a message containing like create a new to-do and the to-do IDs. Now it's all hard coded because like we can't actually store any data because like we haven't connected the to-do app to our database yet. But as you can see now, here on the browser, we can't like, we have no way to like post a post request. And that's why we are here using the Postman. So now let's actually add a new request. So let's add request. So let's do create a new to-do request. Let's change it to this request. And so the URL will be the same. It will be the same URL. However, the request method here, you should change it to post. I can click save here. Also, if we look at this post endpoint here, it's actually saying that it will take the request.body.content. So it's essentially, it will take not only a request, but it will also use the content within its body. So let's actually put something in the body in the request. So how do we do that? We'll click on the body here, and then we use raw. And we can just like say something here. So let's just do like hello world. Hello world. Let's save it and let's click send. Oh yeah, actually here the content. So why does it have an error appearing? It's essentially because we are not accessing the request.body, but we are accessing the request.body.content here. Essentially, like this is the body object that's receiving. However, there's like no content attribute. Now, how do we solve that? It's essentially like from text, we can change it to JSON. Let's try some JSON code here. So since the server needs to accept the content attribute, so let's put content here, and let's put hello world as its value. So like that. And let's click save and send. Wait, why is it? Okay, let me just double check. Okay, that's a little bit weird. Okay, we can read the error response. It's saying that it cannot read the property of content of undefined. Okay, let's send it here probably. Wait, no way. Okay, let's look at the code. That's a bit weird. Okay, so one thing we can do is just trying to get rid of this. Like change it to some dummy data and see what do we get. Let's send it again. Wait, what the heck? Oh, actually, yeah, we need to run the server again because like we changed something. Yeah, so let's read the error code. So saying at line 25, that's so weird because like I'm pretty sure there's something defined here. Okay, so you can see like after we change this to a dummy data, it's not working. Like we can see the response from here. However, like I don't think, because like it's pretty weird. Okay, we can try this out. So inside the create, so instead of like writing it as a raw body, let's try to put it here. I don't think it's the. That's so weird. Okay, so let's change it back to request.body.content. Let's do it again. Okay, that's pretty weird. Okay, I'm gonna try something. I think this may have to do with like Express not parsing our stuff like correctly. So what I'm going to try to do is just to use a body parser. Let's see if things like work. That's really weird because like I tried it. I believe the last time I tried it worked. Let's see. Sorry about that. That's like kind of like the issue of live coding. But essentially, I'm still just copy and pasting. Not really sure. Oh, okay. I think it's still saying undefined. Oh, that's weird. Okay, so sorry about that. So essentially, like I think I still need to add the body parser here. Let me update the code in the Notion real quick. Wait, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. And I think it has something to do with like how Express parse the URL with the router. There's maybe some compatibility issue. And yeah, so let's do this. Let's add some code here. Okay. And this is like the updated code. And essentially what we've added is just this 3-line is essentially allow the app to use the body parser. Like it's kind of weird because like in the last lecture, I believe I tried it out and I deleted the body parser and Express can still parse the body. But right now, maybe it's like two different things. I need to look that up. Probably it's because like right now we are parsing the body, but last lecture we are just trying to parse the the request URL. So yeah, sorry about all the confusion. So right now, after you've added the 3 lines, and you send it the content hello world JSON, you should be able to see the response here. And the response here is essentially it's a message saying you have successfully created a new to-do, and it's the to-do ID followed by the content that we are trying to send here. And if you change the hello world to something else, say like bye-bye world, bye, you send it again and you will change to bye-bye world. And that's like how the client will communicate with the server. It's essentially by sending a request, and the request contains some like information that the server can use. And after it's getting sent to the server, and the server can like get the things that's from the body, and then they can send it back directly, or they can do some processing in the like during the middle of the API endpoints. It's all depending like what kind of task do you want to do. So yeah, are there any questions up till this point? Cool. So let's move on. And now we have already like finished visiting the to-dos endpoint. And let's now try to see like a more interesting endpoint. And this endpoint is saying the route to-dos. However, there's like a column and followed by to-do ID. And what is this trying to do is essentially trying to say that this is a parameter that is going to be changed with the URL. So essentially like when you are visiting our like to-do app, when you are trying to visit like one specific to-do, so for example, if you're trying to visit like one, right now you get a message, get the content from a to-do, because like it's essentially like a dummy to-do app. But essentially like after we have connected our database onto this app, we can we can like get the one from this to-do ID and essentially like return it, and then essentially like get the corresponding to-do from like get the corresponding first to-do, for example, if here the ID is 1. Let's actually try this out in Postman, because in Postman it will be a little bit more interesting. So if you are only sending a GET request, so I have added a 1 to the URL. And if you are just sending a GET request, you can like clear the body for now. You will get the content from a to-do. However, if you, because like this is just hard coded from our code. However, if you look at the put method here, it's much more interesting. So let's do that. If we change it to a put, oops. So if we change it to a put method, we can see that in the server, it takes in on 2 things. First of all, it takes in the params, and this params.to-do ID is a way for the Express to access this to-do ID that's like changing in the HTML, in the URL request. In the URL, it's 1, and the to-do ID here, it will be 1. And the request of body content is going to be like the body content that we just set up, which is like content, let's say first to-do content. Let's save it and make sure the method is put. And after we click send, you can see that here it's saying update the to-do, and the to-do ID is 1, and here is followed by like the content of the to-do. We can try to change it, for example, to like 9,990. We send it again. The to-do ID got updated, and also you can also update the body content. So for example, here, change it here, it's being updated. So essentially, like this is how you will use the Postman to communicate to this like dummy to-do app. And here we also have a delete method that we can try this out. Let's try to change the HTTP message here from put to delete. Let's send it. And we got a message delete a to-do. So yeah. And this is for all the endpoints that we're trying to like test out our HTTP server. And this is essentially like the core of Postman. It's essentially sending requests to a server. And this way you can basically like quickly test out whether the endpoint for the server that you're trying to build is working or not. And this is a very powerful tool. And if you don't want to use this graphic user interface, you can also like click. You can also click save as, like save here, and you can save as something else. And I believe there's also like a method where you can convert it to code. That's like pretty useful as well. I can't find it right now, but yeah, it's like somewhere. Yeah, so essentially like you can also export it as like Python code or JavaScript code, and you can then use that Python code or JavaScript code to like send requests automatically if you want. But this is essentially like a pretty good way for you to keep track of like all the API endpoints that you are like using. So yeah, that's for Postman. Any questions? Actually, I believe someone just joined. Let me just take a screenshot real quick. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. So let's go back to our Notion. So yeah, below is essentially like a quick introduction of Postman. It's saying like how do you like create a request, and then yeah, we explain this in much more detail. You can also like create API requests using Postman. Yeah, blah blah blah. Yeah, and this should be pretty detailed, and it's exactly the same thing from the lecture. Cool. So that's it for Postman. And now let's quickly introduce Flask. So let's close Postman for now. And let's stop this REST API. Okay. Now let's introduce Flask. So Flask is essentially a web framework that's built using Python. So essentially, instead of using Node, you can or JavaScript, you can also use Python to build a web server. And Flask is surprisingly very similar to Node.js. And it's also very, very easy to write. Let's take a look at it. And to install Python, let's do this. Let's first of all create a directory called Flask demo. And let's go to this directory. Let's clear everything. And you can do pip install Flask. Okay, cool. Because like I already have Flask. So if you install it, it's going to like it's not going to be showing up. Actually, why I'm using Python-m? Let's try this out. This is actually doing the same thing. Okay, not exactly sure, but yeah, you can use pip install Flask or Python-m pip install Flask. So that's that. And I believe you have, if you're using like macOS, you should have pip already installed on your computer. However, if you're using Windows, you can find pip pretty easily. Windows here, like, yeah, it should be pretty easy to install. If you have like already taken like 61A, you should already have pip on your computer. So yeah, that's pip. And pip is essentially a package manager that's very similar to npm. And yeah, and now let's create our first hello world Flask file. And okay, so let's copy it, create a file. Actually, let's copy it into it first. Create a file. Let's call it hello.py. Just trying to be consistent with the tutorial. And cool. Now let's look at this. Now let's look at this Flask API real quick. Unable to resolve. Oh, yeah. I don't know why it's showing up this error. I believe I already installed it. Probably just a VS Code glitch. So as you can see, this is how we import the Flask package. To use Flask, it's very similar to use Express. You also need to create an app by calling this. It's Flask and name. Name is essentially like the name of this, like this file. And after you call it, you can have access to like many of the cool methods that Flask is trying to provide. And here, one very important method is this decorator called app.route. And app.route is very, very similar to the app.get here in the node.js. It's, well, first of all, instead it's in Python. And secondly, it's like, besides that, it's essentially the same. It's saying that if we access the our server at the root URL, you will be greeted with this hello world string. So now let's close this node server and blah, blah, blah. And to run the Flask application, it's kind of like, it's a little bit tricky. And you do this. So essentially it's saying that, so when we're trying to run a Flask app, we are going to use a command called Flask run. And however, if you're just like directly doing it, the Flask package will not know like which file should we run. We need to like kind of like give it an entry point. And that's where the Flask app equals hello.py comes in. So this is essentially telling Flask that once you use Flask run, it will run this hello.py Python file. You can also do like Python hello.py, but that's like, this is like the more recommended way to run a Flask file. So let's do that. As you can see here, after we run this, you can see it's saying that it's the Flask app is running on this localhost 5000. So let's copy this this URL and paste it in the browser. You can see in the window, it's saying hello world. So yeah, you should be able to get in this hello world. As you can see, like Flask is actually like simpler than Node. Because like you don't for Node API, for Node server, you need to like include the app.listen, like blah 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 inside the file. However, here Flask will handle it for you. So yeah, that's pretty neat. Okay, so up till this point, are there any questions for Flask? It can be like questions related to setup. If you have any problems with setting up Flask, you can also ask me. Cool, so let's continue. So now we have this like hello world route, but we kind of want to like learn more about Flask. So let's see. Okay, and I just copied the 3 endpoints from the Notion file. Essentially, let's look at each one of them. So here, this is essentially like another route that we have defined. If we go to like my secret page, so let's copy it, paste it here. Oops, yeah, we need to start the, yeah, I believe we need to start the server again. So let's do that. Yeah, so after you copy the 3 route here, after you restart the server, you should be able to see like, you visit like my secret page, you should be able to see like here inside the route, inside the page. Essentially, like this is how you can build like a normal route inside a Flask or a static route. It's very similar to Node. You just like, and it's super straightforward. You just put the route inside this app.route, and essentially this function will handle like everything. Will handle like after like you visit this API endpoints. So yeah, that's for the secret. That should be pretty straightforward. And now let's look at the second endpoint or the third endpoint. The third endpoint here is saying user, and then there's like a pointy bracket and username. So what does this username mean? It's essentially the same thing. Like it's essentially like if you remember from our previous Node server app, we use like column to do ID to like capture any like dynamic ID that user input to our app. And here, if we use the this like pointy bracket and username, it can dynamically capture like any username that user put inside this like the URL. So let's try this out. So yeah, the API endpoints user and username. So let's do username. Let's just do Alex Wu. And after you visit this URL, you can see like it's saying welcome Alex Wu, and this is how you would retrieve the information from the URL. And it's essentially pretty straightforward. After you use this pointy bracket, you put it as like one of the parameter in the function that the app.route is decorating. And the username will automatically be like put here as the input. And you can use it like whatever you want. So that's for that username. Are there any questions?
What is the typical use for Flask? Is it usually to display stuff on the web page, or do you usually use it for something else?
So yeah, so essentially like Flask and Node is all for like building server. Usually it's not for displaying data on a web page. However, it's really useful for compute something that the front end cannot compute on its own. So for example, when you want to like say, I don't know, compute or say, or also like server can be used to connect to databases. So if you want to like create a to-do and then store the to-do into your local server, and then you will use Flask or Node.js, and then the front end will have like a form. And after you submit the form, all the things will like, if we look at like the Postman, if you submit a form on the front end, all the thing will be like here in the body, and then like it will be like content, like username, like password, blah blah blah. And this is essentially like after you submit to this, and then the server can like enter into the database and determine like whether the user is in the database or not. And after that, the server will return, for example, like a Boolean, just say true or false. And the true will basically like indicate the user can log in, and the false will indicate like the user cannot log in. So that's kind of like what the server is useful for. Yeah. And you can also use Flask to like display things on the website. However, that's not like usually the recommended way to do it, because like nowadays front end is being like more and more complicated. People are using like, people usually use React or Vue or Angular or like frameworks like that to handle like things displayed on a web page. And when it comes to like interact with the server, interact with the database, interact with the backend, you will create a server, and then the front end can send requests to the server, and then the server can send response back to the front end. So yeah, that's kind of like the roadmaps that we are trying to do. Any other questions? Cool, now let's move on. And also like here in the URL, you can also see that in this force endpoint, you can see that here in the URL, in the route URL, it's saying like here, instead of like only a post ID and the pointy bracket, there's also like an integer and column. This is essentially saying that post ID has to be an integer. We can try this out. So let's go to blog. It's blog post. If we use an integer, it will say like this is a page for post number 1. However, if we use like say a string, so like post, it will say, it will like receive a 404 not found. And that's essentially like what the integer is doing. It will only match the URL when the URL like ends with a integer. Yeah. This is for that. And these are the very basic routes that we are creating here. You can see like there are more details later. And for a Flask application, there are mainly like 2 kinds of return type. One is the JSON format that we just talked about. It's very similar to like Node. Yeah, because like on the web we use everything. Everything is transmitted through JSON. Like almost everything is transmitted through JSON. Or we can return a template. So essentially, like we can, if the website is really easy, like the front end part is really easy, if we are not using like a very comprehensive front-end framework to support the website, we can just we can just build out the website in the Flask server, and we'll be covering returning a template later. Yeah. First of all, let's look at the JSON format as kind of like the data transmission. So as you can see, like here, this is like a JSON format. We can try to like copy it to the hello world here. Turn it like this. And if we visit the root URL, oh yeah, we forgot to refresh the server. Wait, it's not callable. Okay, yeah, we probably cannot just directly return the JSON data like this. But yeah, but essentially like there's some like JSONify package that we should be using. I believe we'll talk about this like later in the course. But yeah, essentially, but right now here we are only returning strings. However, we still have off some packages. We can return JSON data, and JSON data is like much more powerful than just like returning strings or integers. So yeah. And also, there's also template. And template is another return type for a Flask application. Essentially, template is where like if the front end is super easy, if it's just like a few, and if it's like static, mostly static, you can use it. You can build it out by using a Jinja template. Let's see this Jinja template. So Jinja, I believe it comes with the Flask application. So let's see. And first of all, we need to create a folder called templates within the Flask demo folder. So let's do that. And we go to the templates, and then we create a file called hello.html. Okay. Let's go back. In the VS Code, here you can see there's a hello.html. We can also like, we can write HTML code here. However, here, we are actually going to use a template language. It's called Jinja. And Jinja is essentially a way for you to write HTML code kind of like dynamically that can combine with Flask very easily. And here you can see that there are like brackets here, like if name, else, and if. And this is essentially like you can inject logic into a HTML file by using Jinja template. And this is saying that if there's a name that's like passing to this template, it will return hello name as a h1 headline tag, and otherwise it will return the hello stranger. We can try this out by also adding this into the Flask. So let's add that. So from Flask, we also import render template. Let's put the hello world down here. Okay. As you can see here, we have added two routes. And by adding two decorator to one function, it's saying that we'll first match the first route. And if we cannot match the first route, we'll match the second route. And this function will be in charge of both these two routes. And here, the function takes in a parameter called name. And the name's default value is none. This is essentially like handling this app.route route. If there is a name, then it will not take the none like default value. It will actually be a name. And you will return render template. And render template here, we follow by the template name, which is the template we just created. It's called hello.html. And we also passing a parameter called name equals name. It's essentially like saying that the variable we are passing into it is called name, and the value is also name. So let's hit save, and let's run it. Okay, let's hit refresh, and let's go to this hello URL. You can see if we only go to the hello URL without putting our names there, we will get the hello stranger returned. And it can be like multiple lines. So say like, hello stranger, do you want to log in or sign in? Close the tag, like login. Here is a login button. And if there's like, if we already know the user, we can say something else. So like, hello Alex, hello or the user, welcome back. And here it will be like a button to like sign out. We can like refresh the Flask. As you can see, like here, we can build like really like complex logic just using like Jinja template. If we visit like say Alex, you will say hello Alex, well, welcome back. You can also add some like logic to handle like sign out when you click sign out. And if like when you're signing out, for example, the Flask, you can like let the Flask application to redirect it to the hello route. After redirected, it will be like hello stranger. After you click login, you can build some very complex knowledge, some very complex logic just by using the Jinja template and also like the Flask endpoints. So essentially, like if the so this is kind of like an introduction to template. Personally, I don't use template with Flask because like I feel like template is it's a not that modern way to write front-end code. Like to be honest, I would suggest you like learn React if you want to like really like work on both front-end and backend instead of like using template. But using template can be a very good starting point. And as you like build more and more like website, you will see like how React or more like or a similar framework will be more powerful than like simple template. But yeah, so that's for template and Flask. And that I believe that will be all of our like Flask, very brief Flask introduction. Any questions? Okay, we will stop the recording.